the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello everybody. A couple of years ago we did a great show with my old friend Richard Reeves on what he sees as today's crisis of masculinity. He had a book out back then, Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters and What to Do About It. The book has done very well. Another person who has spent their career looking at the crisis of masculinity is our guest today. Niobe Way had a book out back in 2011, Deep Secrets, Boys, Friendships, and the Crisis of Connection. The Secrets of Boys, according to The New Yorker. It was an influential book, and she's a very influential thinker. Her work inspired a wonderful film, a wonderful 2022 film called Close, a Belgian film about a relationship between two boys. And now she has a new book out. It's called Rebels with a Cause, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves, and Our Culture. Niobe Way teaches her day job at New York University. She's talking to us from her home in the East Village. Niobe, congratulations on the new book, Rebels with a Cause. Have you read? I assume you've read the Reeves book.
Yeah, I've read most of the stuff that's come out on boys and young men. Yes,
What did you think of Richard Reeves' book?
Well, I think the basic premise is a good one. I'm taking a different take, not only from Richard Reeves, but from a lot of people that write about boys and men. So the basic take that I agree with Richard is that boys and young men are struggling, and they are struggling in a specific way, and it definitely has to do with masculinity. And so I think that sort of calling attention to that they are struggling, that it has to do with the culture of masculinity that Richard Reeves talks about, I think is important and critical and real. The part that I come in that's different from not only Richard, but I would say most of the people who write about boys and young men, is that it became very clear to me after writing the book back in 2011, and then getting an enormous reaction from around the world.
This is the Deep Secrets book.
I wrote Deep Secrets in 2011. I thought it was just small. Honestly, I thought it was a small academic book. I expected to get some, good feedback from academics, et cetera. I didn't expect the explosion of interest and attention from all sorts of mainstream press, and then emails, and I still get them, by the way, Andrew, emails from around the world, from boys and men, and also from everyone else saying, either you're telling my story, or you're telling my brother's story, or my father's story, or why didn't we have this book when I was younger? It was unbelievable, and I still get that now. 12 years later, I still get people wanting to interview me around that book. The new book, and I'll answer your question about Richard Reeves. The new book really makes the point that what Boys and Young Men teach us, however, is not just about boys and young men. It's about all of us. And what is oftentimes called the culture of masculinity, I call it quote unquote boy culture, and I'll tell you about the difference, is affecting all of us, and it's at the root of all of our crises of connection, our depression rates, our anxiety, our suicide, our loneliness, our mass violence. It's really at the root. Boy culture is really at the root of that. And so when we see it just as a problem for boys and young men, we sort of miss we miss the forest for the trees. And so we miss seeing that, in fact, yes, it definitely affects boys and young men, but it's affecting everybody in the way we're privileging what I'm calling in the book, the so-called hard over the so-called soft, the masculine over what we have masculinized over what we have feminized. And that's getting in our capacity to not only thrive, but also to survive.
Niobe, as I said earlier, you're a professor at NYU, a professor of applied psychology.
Yeah.
you've been, and I'm not sure if this is the right word, you've been studying boys now your entire career. So your work is deeply empirical. How did you begin this career of observing men, boys, and masculinity?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. I love answering the question. So I appreciate the question. So I started out, I was fascinated by teenagers when I was a teenager. I mean, I was fascinated by what people were calling being a teenager. And I was one at the time. And I was fascinated. I ended up going into working with teenagers right out of college, and then went to my doctoral program at Harvard about 2 years after I graduated from college to really investigate what is this thing people are calling teenagers and adolescents, et cetera. And as part of my doctoral training, I was a counselor, a sort of volunteer counselor in a local high school. And I started to meet with kids I wasn't professionally trained. I was just sort of meeting with kids to help them out. And I was just struck by how much the boys, this is 1987, Andrew, this is 1987, how much the boys were talking about their friendships and talking about wanting friendships, wanting close friendships, talking about other guys betraying their trust and feeling hurt by them. I mean, I was just stunned by it. And I couldn't believe that I thought they were going to talk about girls. I thought they were going to talk about their parents or their teachers or school or whatever it was. I didn't expect this friendship. And the interesting thing, Andrew, is that I was a doctoral student. So I was taking courses on adolescent development at Harvard, and they basically weren't covering anything I was hearing in these sessions. So I was taking a class on adolescence, and they weren't talking about friendships. They weren't talking about friendships that boys want and need. And so I became, in some ways, you could say, obsessed with trying to understand why it is that we're not telling this story and what is actually going on with boys and friendships. And this is 1987. So
before we went live, Niobe, we were chatting, and it seems as if we know lots of people in common, including your brother.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're female. As a young woman outside academia, what was your sense growing up? It sounds like you had a rather eccentric father. You had a brother who you were close to. You obviously knew men. What was your sense outside of research, outside of academia, that there was an issue, perhaps a crisis of masculinity as you were growing up in the 70s and 80s?
Yeah. So it's also a great question because it feeds in. What essentially happened is as a young person listening to teenagers at a local high school, it made me have memories of, I have two brothers actually. Lucan and Justin are both brothers.
And Lucan's a distinguished political scientist. What does the other one do?
Yeah, Justin works in trust and safety policy at TikTok. So I both I'm very, very different brothers, but very successful brothers. And what it reminded me of, Andrew, is how much their friendships had played out in their own lives. And I have two quick stories to tell you to make the point. I remember when Justin and I are many, many years, I'm much older than he is. And I remember it was probably in my 20s. I was listening to Justin in the backyard. He was a teenager at the time. And he was talking to his best friends, a set of best friends he had in high school, that one of the boys had hurt the other boy's feelings. And Justin was trying to negotiate that relationship and help them sort of mend the relationship. And I remember sitting there. I didn't remember this story until I heard it from the boys in the high school. And Justin was sitting there, and I realized he was really trying to get the friendship to work between these two other guys. And the second story with Lucan, I remember so clearly once I had heard the pattern outside of my family, I remembered it in my family. I remember Lucan having a friend when he was very little, and that friend, for some reason, dropping the friendship. We still never knew really why that friendship was dropped. And I just remember Lucan being heartbroken by it, and talking a lot about it and being very hurt by this other boy. And that was in Oberlin. We lived in Oberlin at the time. And I just realized that it was an amazing thing to realize that what I was hearing from the boys in this high school, and these boys were very different demographically from my family. They were mostly boys of color, mostly coming from poor and working class communities in urban Boston. And I grew up in a very different context. So that enhanced my interest in it because I realized, oh, it's everywhere. It's not just a certain group.
And what about Niobe? This isn't. I'm sure you have to deal with this question all the time.
No.
The gendered element, because it sounds like what you're saying, that we all seek connection and we're lonely and all the rest of it. And we'll get to perhaps more detail on that. It's not just a problem of men; it's a problem of women too. Is there a difference, though, in your view, in terms of how the crisis of loneliness, I know your next book is on that, has played out in gendered terms between men and women?
Absolutely. So basically, I want to bring in the concept of boy culture because that's the concept in my new book. So the idea of boy culture, first of all, I want to be very clear to all the listeners, especially the men who are listening to this. This is not
and the boys. We have boys as well.
And the boys. This is not a trashing. It's the opposite. Boys teach us about boy culture. And I put boy in quotation because it's a cartoon character. It's a caricature of a boy. It's not a real boy. And how I know that is because I've been listening to boys since 1987. So it's the idea of privileging thinking over feeling, stoicism over vulnerability, the me over the we, cognition over connectedness. Cognition over emotion, autonomy over connectedness, money over people. I mean, I could go on and on. So the idea is what we've deemed hard over what we've deemed soft, or masculine over femininity. The reality is all humans are hard and soft. All humans think and feel. All humans want autonomy and they want connection. All humans need to be able to be stoic and also allow themselves to be vulnerable when they want to form connections. So the idea is that stoicism and vulnerability are equally important in human development. And so what you get in boy culture when we privilege the heart of the soft, is everybody is expected to man up, essentially. But obviously, Andrew, I mean, I'm not being silly about this. Obviously, boys and men are more expected because that's part of what it means to be a man. But we also have what it means to be mature. So to be mature, you're supposed to be self-sufficient. You're supposed to be autonomous. There's nothing about being able to have mutually supportive relationships and our notion of maturity. So that's where it affects girls and women and all gender, whatever your gender identity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's so much here to unpack, Niobe, but implicitly, I think you've explained to me one of the great mysteries of why stoicism now is so much in fashion, particularly it seems amongst men. I know one or two highly male writers, rather odd characters, who have made careers out of writing about stoicism. And it amazes me in two ways. Firstly, that it's become so popular. Yeah. And secondly, that these people who are so odd have become such sort of powerful cultural voices.
Yeah. Oh, Andrew, I'm enjoying this interview so far. I really enjoy these questions. Yeah. No, I mean, basically, the thing about boy culture is once you understand what the waters in which we swim. So it's the waters in which we swim. We privilege the hard sciences over the soft sciences. I could go on and on and on. We privilege STEM over humanities and poetry. Anything that numbers over words, anything that we can make.
When you say we, what is this? A Gramscian notion of culture, politics? Publishing houses, television stations?
It's if you want to get into philosophy, it's Bourdieu's notion of habitas. I mean, the idea is it's in the water. It's everything we do is privileging the heart over the soft. And once you see it, you see it's everywhere. So the reason why men are getting into emphasizing stoicism so much at this point is because not only have we defined it as what it means to be mature, but also, of course, what it means to be a man. And the sort of dismissing of the soft sides of ourselves as indicative of being, it's not just that you shouldn't be soft, Andrew, let's be real here. It's that being soft is lame, makes you pathetic, makes you women oftentimes get called overly sensitive, which I always tell my women students, there's no such thing as being overly sensitive. You're just sensitive because you're human. And the idea is that we diss on, as kids say, we diss on the soft. So once we diss on what is half of our humanity, right? If you think about humanity as a yin and a yang, we're too much yang. We're valuing all the yang. We're not valuing the yin. We basically become unbalanced, because we are naturally hard and soft. And that's what boys teach me. That's what they teach us, is that we are naturally hard and soft. This is not an imposition. I'm not making boys into girls or all kinds of things I've been accused of in the past. It's listening to boys and hearing their natural soft sides And obviously, Andrew, they're natural hard sides. So seeing both sides of their humanity and seeing how much they're asking us, their cause ultimately really is to allow them and to nourish both sides of their humanity. And that's what really everybody's saying, all young people are saying, is to value their tender, sensitive, glorious, ways of reading each other's emotions and connecting deeply.
And I'm sure some people, Niobe, have suggested that you're trying to feminize boys. How would you respond to that?
Well, I sort of love that question, because in some ways, if you read the book, if you read any of my stuff, I have hundreds and hundreds and thousands of quotes in there from boys revealing their soft side, talking about their sensitivity, wishing that other boys would be more soft, or more sensitive rather, and not laugh when they feel vulnerable, etc. So that ultimately the argument that I'm doing anything doesn't make any sense once you see the data. And that's honestly, Andrew, why my book's always packed with data, so that it doesn't sound ideological. I'm not presenting a perspective.
Although I always say this to all my guests, and Niobe, when they bring the D word up data, I always think that whenever they use data, it's polemical, and that you can always find data anyone can find any data to support any argument if they choose.
No, I mean, and when I say data, because I'm not a numbers person for this argument, certainly it's the words of young people themselves. So
what about you talk about soft and hard, of course.
Yeah.
Some people might be hearing some sexual elements there in the excellent movie Close. It wasn't a film about homosexual boys, but there was some suggestions of it. What about the sexual element here? Homosexuality, both amongst men and women, has become much more mainstream and acceptable. Is there a connection between that still and the crisis? Is sexuality central in this, or is it almost epiphenomenal?
Basically, what I hear from when I talk, and of course I talk to, at this point, I mean, I've been doing this for decades. So I talk to all sorts of young people of all sorts of sexual identities as well. That the privileging of and I always say what we've deemed masculine over what we've deemed feminine, because it's we've made this up, that feeling is feminine, because feeling is a human thing. It's not a gendered thing. Same with thinking. Thinking is not gendered, it's a human thing. But what we've deemed masculine over what we've deemed feminine, remember that feminine is also being girly and gay, and that's still a slur. So being gay, you're so gay, that's so gay, is considered that's so lame. So even though we progressed, Andrew, I'm not saying we haven't progressed in some ways in terms of our sense of inclusion of people of all different identities, we still think that being soft or feminine or girly or gay is a slur. I mean, it's meaning you're kind of pathetic. And so the idea is that for gay young people who identify as gay in various different sexualities, they will also relate to the findings to say that they have to be so-called appear stoic to be attractive. And that,
although ironically, Niobe, and correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe this oversimplifies things, perhaps one reason for the increasing acceptance and indeed even fashionability, if there's such a word, of homosexuality, is that it creates certain kinds of community. I live in San Francisco, just above the Castro neighborhood, which is obviously being created strongly around the identity of being homosexual. Is there a connection, do you think, between our acceptance or more of a mainstreaming of gay identity and this longing for community?
Yeah, you know what? I think you're spot on. I mean, I actually think people, not just boys and men, but people of all identities look for communities in which they can express both sides of their humanity. So I think that, young men who identify as gay, finding a gay community that accepts all their full selves is obviously very attractive. I also think that in a culture that sexualizes human desire for each other, because we do it particularly with men, but we do it with women too, is that confusion gets in the way. We think that, if I'm so attracted to this person emotionally, I must be sexually attracted to them, or am I sexually attracted? And that's where I think we get confused oftentimes, because emotional attraction Sometimes can be sexual. I mean, sometimes it can. When you're straight, it can be sexual around same-sex people too. But the idea is oftentimes that emotional attraction to people, that wanting to spend time with them, wanting to talk about things, wanting to explore the world with them, really is just a fundamentally human desire. And we've gendered and sexualized it, and it's human. And that's really the point of Close. Is to
yeah, it's a wonderful film. I was actually very excited when I knew that. I didn't realize that you'd inspired the film. I love that film. As I said, we're going to have to take a break in a second, Niobe, but you're a professor of applied psychology at NYU. Sounds as if you're not much of a Freudian. Are you a Jungian? Is there a psychologist who has inspired your work, who saw this before anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, my work is very much rooted in Carol Gilligan, who was my mentor at Harvard back in the
very
80s.
influential American psychologist. But what's Gilligan's thesis then? So
Gilligan basically brings in the 1980s two things. First thing psychology by the late 70s rarely included girls and women in the conversation about human development. So she brings in girls and women into the conversation about what it means to be human. But more importantly, and Andrew, this is really critical to my book, more importantly, she says that there's a so-called male bias in psychology with its emphasis on autonomy and separation and the self in understanding who we are, and that she brings in what she calls a relational voice into understanding humans. That's in her book, In a Different Voice in 1982. And so she talks about relationships, a care voice, which is not just a caring for others, but also a caring for self. And so that work is central because what she says, because we know each other, we've been having lunch for about 2 decades now every week. What she says is that when she heard my work that came out in the 90s, 2000s, and 2011 with Deep Secrets, she said she finally saw that what she was saying is really a human voice. She called it in a different voice, not a woman's voice, but she called it in a different voice. And then she came out recently with a book called In a Human Voice, including of my work and the boys. So that the relational voice, we're born in relationships, Andrew. We grow up needing those relationships, but we're living in a boy culture that doesn't value those relationships, and hence we struggle.
I hope we're not having a boy conversation now, are we, Niobe?
What do you mean?
A good conversation, is it?
Oh, good.
Have we escaped gender here? Is conversation itself?
Yeah, I think we have. No, I mean, basically your questions are great. I mean, it allows me to articulate.
They're soft rather than hard questions. Is that one way of putting it?
Yes, exactly. Soft and hard questions.
I will tell my wife.
Good.
I couldn't resist that one. Niobe Way, the author of Rebels with a Cause. Great to have this conversation. You've got this new book. Is out this week, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves and Our Culture. I think it will have the same impact as Richard Reeves's book and your earlier book, Deep Secrets. I want to thank our friends at Liberties Quarterly, a quarterly of culture and politics, edited by Leon Wieseltier, who brings us such great guests as Niobe Way. We're going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Niobe to talk more about Rebels with a Cause. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. Much encouraged. We are speaking with Niobe Way, the author of Rebels with a Cause. Niobe, before we went live, you noted that your father had been a professor of antiquity. Explains also your unusual name, Niobe, named after a goddess, Niobe Way. I wonder if history, in a sense, is repeating itself. When we talked earlier in the first part of the show about Stoicism and the fashion for Stoicism, you had this shift, of course, in antiquity from the political communitarianism, perhaps, of Socrates, the love of talk, or perhaps what you might describe as soft, to the hardness of Roman culture. In terms of a narrative, was there an earlier period in America where perhaps America conformed more to the softness of Socratic Athens?
Okay, so now you're giving me the goosebumps with your questions. Yes, a very clear, strong yes. And I write about it in Deep Secrets. So basically what it looks like, looking at the social listening and reading, I read everything. I'm a great reader, so I read across traditions. Looking at social historians before essentially World War II, in the 19th century in particular, and then the early 20th century, you have enormous evidence of a kind of, if you just focus on friendships, a kind of male friendships, and I'm talking about within an American context, in which there was tremendous intimacy, emotional intimacy shared between men through letters, through all sorts of types of correspondence, writing poetry, for each other. And it seems like from the data, and again, this is now my opinion, this is not coming from data I've actually collected, but it seems like World War II, essentially we have FDR, which you could say FDR's administration was very soft in many ways, emphasizing helping each other and helping communities, helping elderly, et cetera.
Although, of course, jumping back, his cousin, Teddy, was very hard.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. So that's an interesting thing. All right. I mean, trying to play it out. And also FDR apparently was less soft than he appears to be in what he did. But the idea is that FDR comes in, and then we have World War II. And then it appears that starting around, post World War II, women are brought home from the workplace because now men are coming home from war. And there's this real push to sort of put women in this sort of role of being at home and men to go out to work and being responsible for the family. And you start getting that kind of hyper-masculinity evidence of it. And I think it's classic that Rebels Without a Cause, the movie that sparked the book.
Yes, of course, the Brando.
The James Dean movie, right? The James Dean.
Right.
Comes out in 1956, Rebels Without a Cause. And what's incredible about that, Andrew, I mean, you got to rewatch that movie, because it's the whole film. James Dean is trying to find a friend. Literally, that's the whole film. And he acts out in ways to try.
Yeah, I wonder, speaking of that and thinking aloud, Niobe, what happened? I mean, the classic explanation would be, particularly from perhaps progressive academics, is that we can blame capitalism, or we can blame the crisis of the New Deal or the Cold War. Those are all easy targets.
Yeah.
But I wonder what really happened in the 50s. I mean, what is it? What is the explanation for this?
I'm going to give it. You want me to give it?
Go on, give it.
Okay. So I think, this is what I think, because remember, I'm a psychologist, true. I mean, I'm not a practitioner, I'm a researcher, but I think like a psychologist. I think that I honestly think the trauma of World War II creates, and what we hear even from boys in my sample, and you hear it from mass shooters, right? There's a whole chapter in my new book on mass shooters. The kind of moral trauma of war that creates a disconnection to the self, right? A disconnection from the self, from your soft side, because you can't fight a war connecting to your soft side. It's not possible. So that kind of disconnection creates essentially young men and old men who come home from the war traumatized. And so ultimately that trauma creates a kind of looking to just emphasize the hard side to try to get on top of the hierarchy of humanness, which I talk a lot about in my book, all of us wanting to get on top, but the top means denying our soft sides. So
why didn't that, I mean, maybe it makes sense, but then why didn't that come out of the First World War, or certainly the Civil War, which were much more brutal wars than the Second World War, especially America's involvement in the Second?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. I don't know that answer, but I do know that whole sense of the trauma, and then the shift. I think there has to be something in there about the shift from women in the workplace during the war, and then coming home from the workplace, to going home, staying at home into the workplace. And obviously, I'm talking about middle class and upper class families. And the idea is that both in some ways are struggling. And then it creates this emphasis on the stoicism and looking for meaning and purpose also, Andrew, from the men's side. So feeling like going to work and, providing for the family is what they can offer. They can't offer the emotional side because they don't want to stay with their emotional side. The other thing, Andrew, I would say is in the 20th century, remember, because we did have Freud, we did have the beginning of discussions of emotions in the way we didn't have in the 19th century, that I also think that brings in this sort of conversation, including about sexuality, right? Including that everything becomes sexualized with Freud. And so we begin to sort of men not wanting to be in that sort of soft category for a variety of reasons.
So as the man in the gray suit, it's interesting that your book obviously references the movie Rebel with a core, the James Dean movie. Yeah. How central then is, in your argument, is Hollywood in all this?
I think it's huge. It's huge. I mean, Hollywood, social media, TikTok, Instagram, I'm going to call them all out.
We can blame your brother. Your brother was.
Yeah, totally. Although he's trying to do good with TikTok. But the idea is that all these forms, our media, including our films, all sorts of media, are just continuing to repeat this so-called, what I call boy culture, in quotations, of course. It repeats it. And the idea is that in order to be mature, manly, successful, modern, all those things, you have to be on top, and being on top is emphasizing your hard side. That's the summary of the argument. So the idea is it all repeats it in movies. You get it again and again. And even when men are soft in movies, it's usually sort of contained so that it's, so it ends up being defined as crying is soft.
Midnight cowboy style soft then.
Yeah, exactly.
With a sad ending.
Exactly. So the idea is that I think this anxiety about not being soft comes in after World War II and then gets sort of exaggerated repeatedly until we get Reaganomics, which then is the
I knew that would come in. Neoliberalism. Yeah. Can we blame it on that?
Absolutely. Are you kidding me, Andrew? We totally can. It's all about the me.
And what about, I don't want to get into that because we've done that too many times, but what about Reagan himself? Was he Mr. Hard?
Yeah, so it's funny because he was Mr. Hollywood, of course, originally, but
Mr. Hard Hollywood.
Yeah, absolutely.
And his involvement with, and his shift from being a Democrat to a Republican. His hostility to communists and his involvement, and of course his role as the governor of California in the 60s.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because if you look at the pattern, you get Jimmy Carter, who's for Americans are seen as way too soft, and then you get Reagan.
Well, he had his woolly cardigan. He was a bit soft, wasn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
Can you be soft and successful? That's the question.
I know, exactly. And then you get let's jump ahead, because I would love to talk about what's happening now. So then you get Obama, who's definitely seen as soft, right? Even though he does a lot of hard things in his administration, he's definitely seen as soft. And then we get Trump, which ultimately, right, we have this anxiety around.
Yeah, we were going to get to Trump. We always get to Trump somehow.
No, but Trump is an interesting character because ultimately he's a reflection of boy culture, as is Obama, by the way.
He could have invented Trump with this argument. He's the ultimate lonely, psychotic, hard male.
Yeah, you got my book. We invented Trump. We created Trump. Trump is an expression of boy culture. And ultimately, the irony about Trump, I'm going to say something that's going to shock everybody on the left. So the irony about Trump is he gets this hierarchy he doesn't get it consciously, because I'm sure it's not conscious. But unconsciously, he gets this hierarchy of humanness we have. And he realizes that if he speaks to those people we put on the bottom, poor people, poor white people, people of color on the bottom, working class, poor people, etc. If he speaks to them and he basically dismisses all those people on the top, the coastal elites, he will feel like he's seeing them. So in some weird way, I would have to say Trump is actually, even if he's not conscious of it, listening to those people we put on the so-called bottom of the hierarchy. And so at some level, to me, what's interesting is that Trump is just an expression of us. He's an expression of getting on the top of the hierarchy of humanness that's all hard and dismisses the soft. But ironically, he actually gets that people that we've been put on the bottom don't want to be on the bottom. Nobody wants to be on the bottom. Who wants to be on the bottom? And so we keep on in the left and the right. And now I'm going to criticize both sides. The left and the right keep on just flipping the hierarchy. We keep on we want to put ourselves on the top and other people on the bottom.
Yeah, we did a show with our mutual friend, Steve Fish,
a
couple of weeks ago, who's written about the issue of leadership and that the Democrats are missing that. Can one respect and recognize the value of leadership without falling into your soft, hard trap?
Yeah. I mean, but basically what you see when you look at leaders that have used their soft skills and their hard skills, and there's numerous examples of them. I mean, in some ways, Obama is an example. I mean, I wasn't 100% thrilled with Obama, but the idea is he used his hard and soft to try to reach people of different, I think, interestingly enough, I know you're not going to agree with me, Andrew, but I think Elizabeth Warren also had sort of a soft side to her and a hard side to her that worked in that framing. Bernie Sanders was all hard. I just think there's lots of leaders that use that hard and soft side, and we're not naming it and valuing it for that. We used to didn't we mock Hillary Clinton when she cried at the videotape of someone getting killed? I forget what the scenario was, but we
mock Hillary, whatever she does. I want to come back to Trump at the end, but I'd also, given the movie title of your book, or the movie Illusions, Rebels with a Cause, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves and Our Culture, and the centrality of Hollywood in your argument, I wonder what you make of the two big films of last year, Oppenheimer and Barbie in particular. We did a number of shows on Barbie. For some people, Barbie reflects the fact that women now, or female values or softness, or whatever you want to describe it, have become dominant in our culture. What do you make of Oppenheimer, which is ultimately about the gloomy, dark, solitary male, and Barbie, of course, which is about the soft, friendly female networker? How do those two films fit into your narrative?
Okay, so I just rewatched Oppenheimer because I was, it's a long movie. I wanted to really unpack it. I think Oppenheimer gets at actually the hard and the soft, and the way it gets at the hard and the soft, I think it's a fantastic movie, because it really is. It comes down hard on Oppenheimer, but also shows his moral ambivalence around what happened. And even with, just with an array of scientists in that film, you see them, you get into that sort of so-called excitement about building something that can really be big and explode. And
who's the ultimate manifestation of the successful fusing of hardness and softness in that film is Einstein.
Oh, totally. It's funny. I was just thinking about Einstein when you said it. Yeah, no, Einstein is perfect. It's a perfect example of that, the hard and the soft. But I would even argue Oppenheimer himself, especially toward the end of the film, you really get his hard and soft side. That he created something incredible, and then he has these really deep moral concerns about what he's done, and this guilt and this. I just think it's fascinating. Barbie, I also think, is more complicated than we see it. So Barbie, at first when I watched Barbie, because I'm always trying to, yell at everybody, don't flip the hierarchy. You can't put men on top or women on top, or, poor people on. You can't. Nobody wants to be on the bottom, so don't stop flipping the hierarchy. So when I first watched Barbie, I thought, oh my God, they're going to flip the hierarchy and make women amazing and men, pathetic. However, and there was a little bit of that. It was a little bit of mocking men in that, obviously. But there's a sentence at the end of the film, Andrew, where Barbie says to Ken, you have to says something to the effect of, yourself has to not just be being connected to me. It has to be, you have to love yourself. You can't just love yourself because it's Barbie and Ken. And so that sentence at the end just meant that Greta Gerwig, the writer of it, got it, that this is not a trashing of men. This is a trying to get men to see themselves outside of sort of having eye candy as a partner. And so the idea is, I actually thought there was more nuance in Barbie of not trying to flip the hierarchy, but definitely there's a kind of, mocking of men in that, which can feel like you're just flipping the hierarchy.
I should have asked you this question at the beginning, Niobe, because we sort of jumped into all the fun stuff.
Yeah.
But very briefly, because we got to end in a few minutes. Just remind us, in perhaps in terms of data of this crisis.
Yeah.
I know you were quoted in an interesting LA Times piece about more than 1 in 7 men have no close friends. I wonder whether that's true of women too.
Yeah.
Your thesis about loneliness being the next global health threat, of course, is one that's shared by a number of other people. What's actually going on in the culture when it comes to male loneliness and this crisis of masculinity?
I would say it's not this is the difference between the previous book and now book. I wouldn't say it's a crisis of masculinity. It's a crisis of connection caused by boy culture, which is essentially a culture that clashes with our nature and our needs.
Okay, so I take that point, but what would be, you've mentioned data a couple of times. Is there a single or a couple of data points that really reflect your arguments in Rebel with a Cause? What are the data points that really stand out, that reflect whatever it is, whether it's a crisis or a situation?
So the data point that I write a lot about, there's a lot of chapters on it, as well as in the chapter on mass shooters, there's also a transition point. Essentially, it's when boys are increasingly pressured to man up, they seem to go underground with their emotional needs and their emotional acuity. And so the idea is hearing these at this point, it's been thousands. I've been doing it for almost 4 decades. You hear these lovely, incredibly emotionally intelligent, relationally intelligent stories from boys at 11, 12, 13, 14. And then at 15 and 16, you start to hear this very different voice, this sort of sometimes angry, sometimes sad, sometimes what I call the whatever voice. It doesn't matter. I'm good. Everything's good. But they don't really seem to mean it. So you hear this transition as boys become men. But then I began to hear a similar transition, because you've asked me about gender differences many times and I haven't really responded. You also hear a transition among girls where they sort of know what they know. This is Carol Gilligan's work. They know what they know at 8, 9, and 10. They're truth tellers. They speak truth to power. And by the time they're 13 and 14, they're saying things like, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And then they you start to see cutting and eating disorders and all sorts of things among girls. So there is a way in which if you raise children to be in a culture that doesn't value both thinking and feeling, right? Thinking for girls and feeling for boys, they end up suffering because they end up disconnecting from their humanity, basically. So you see the evidence of that in adolescence. And so adolescence, the reason I'm obsessed with adolescence is because that's when you see the dramatic impact of culture on what it means to be human. And then it sets off a lifetime of struggle. And for men, it's about friendships. And for women, it's about voicing their own needs, thoughts and needs and feelings within a relationship. So bringing the self into their relationship. And for men, it's making sure the other is included, right?
And our adolescences these days, of course, are extended. They seem to be, we've done shows on this, extended into the 20s, sometimes even 30s, kids now continuing to live at home. So, Niobe, there's so much here. We'll have to get you back on the show. I know you're coming to the Bay Area. We'll do an in-person interview later this year.
Great.
But you mentioned Trump as a manifestation of this boy culture.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're no great fan of Donald Trump, nor am I, nor are most of our listeners.
Yeah.
And yet you also suggested that his message of boy culture or boy culture in crisis and all the contradictions of boy culture has resonated. What do we do about all this? How do we on the one hand head off this Trumpian masculinity, and on the other hand recognize the needs and desires of boys and men?
Yeah, and everybody else, basically.
And everybody, and women, and all the rest of it.
So this is a message to the Democratic Party, including Biden. What we have to begin to do fundamentally as Democrats, as people that care about their country, care about the world, is to start listening with curiosity. And by listening with curiosity, I don't mean just to not talk. I mean to actually investigate why is it that people are voting for Trump. And once they understand why people are voting for Trump, and I'll tell you the number one reason they're voting for Trump, because Trump says you don't belong on the bottom. You don't belong on the bottom. I value, I mean, whether it's true, it's not relevant whether it's true. But he says, I value you. I see you as fully human. I don't see you as what white people do with other white people. Poor white people is call them white trash. I don't see you as trash. I see you as real people. So even though Trump doesn't intentionally listen, because I don't know it's possible for him, he actually hears what they're saying. We don't want to be on the bottom. So if the Democrats began listening with curiosity to understand why people are voting for Trump, it's not because they're just fucking assholes. It's that actually they want to be taken seriously. They want to be seen as fully human. Yes, they might be racist, they might be sexist, et cetera, but they still want, right? They still oftentimes want the same things we want. They want to be able to feed their children, raise their children, have a good life, have a happy family. And once we recognize that, we stop doing the flipping the hierarchy. And Biden does it the same thing. I mean, he flips the hierarchy. He says, listen to that whole debate, Andrew. One person is saying you're the worst and I'm the best. The other person is saying you're the worst, I'm the best. I mean, it was all about, the whole debate was about trying to flip who's on top and who's on bottom. That's ridiculous. We're older than that. We're more mature than that. It should be about actually figuring out, why do we have so many people supporting Trump? And to me, it's an obvious answer. They want to be seen as fully human. They want to be listened to. They want to be not put on the bottom of the hierarchy.
So I assume you like the work of an old friend of mine who's been on the show several times, Ali Hochschild, who's written extensively about this. Of course.
I mean, basically, and the Democrats need to stop trying to flip the hierarchy, because the more they do it, the more we lose. So
ironically, it's the Democrats who have embraced this stereotyping of gender in an odd way more than the Republicans.
I have to say, I'm gonna get pushback on this when I agree with you, but I couldn't agree with you more. There's a way in which we have reified, the sort of gender, in academic terms, the gender binary on the left. That's shocking, given that we think that we accept gender flexibility, but in fact, in that gender flexibility, we've reified he and she in ways that's actually quite shocking. And so I would say the work, especially because I'm on the left, the work really has to be done within the left, within the liberals, the Democratic Party, to begin to really understand that fundamentally no one wants to be on the bottom. And so how do we create a society that actually puts nobody on the bottom, but actually recognizes that we all want to not only thrive, but we all want to survive and live a good life. And how do we do that collectively?
Well, nobody wants to be on the bottom. That may be the message of Niobe Way's new book, Rebels with a Cause, Reimagining Boys, Ourselves, and Our Culture. Niobe, real pleasure. Very interesting conversation. We'll get you back on the show. Maybe we can get you and Ali Hochschild on the show later this year to talk about how we progressives will address the crisis. But thank you so much, and congratulations on the new book.
Good. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, take care. Bye.